So this, as Cameron said, this for us is the beginnings of thinking about how we can use the arts to help us to stimulate our creativity, note taking, and the like. And Cameron is also working. We won't be talking about it this morning, but probably will down the line at some of our other events. Cameron is working on a very impressive, large public art project for the National Capital Region that relates to energy and transitioning to lower emissions energy systems and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. So we're very excited to be helping him and supporting him in that. So this is a moment where we get into presentation of the report. It's been an absolute pleasure to work with Mike Cleland on this, my co-conspirator in authoring this document. Tremendously productive writing relationship that we have. Sometimes interesting writing relationship that we have. Always fun, and I always learn a tremendous amount. So please join me in welcoming Mike to the stage.
That usually suggests something that you don't want to expound on that.
After you
anyway,
present. Get to that out of the way. There.
Well, thank you, Monica, and thanks to everyone who took the time to join us this morning for this conversation. We very much appreciate the potential that's out there with the kind of people we have in the room. So with that in mind, and also thanks to our panelists for agreeing to take the time, we want to make as much time as possible for the general exchange, which is a long-winded way of saying I'm going to try to keep this as brief as possible, and if I don't, Monica will make it interesting for me. Let me start with first of all, figuring out how this works. A quick overview of the presentation. I'm going to take a couple of minutes at the outset by way of introduction, framing the challenge. A little bit more time going on from there, talking about Canadian energy and climate policy in a domestic and global perspective, really with a focus on the past and the present. I'm going to hand it off to Monica after that, who will take a forward look centered on this idea of Canada's energy future in an age of climate change. And then a conclusion, which we hope will be positive in the sense of going from partisanship, polarization, and parochialism to public confidence. And we'll see how far we get on that over the next 3 years, but that is our objective and one that we hope to carry out working with people such as yourselves. Very briefly, framing the challenge, and I'm going to go through each of these themes, or I'm going to touch on them very quickly, that we've got ourselves in a very deep hole on this file right now, and we are stuck. And the question is, how do we get out of it? As we try to get out of it, we are dealing with a lot of sources of uncertainty. We can talk about that, but if anything, indications are that that's growing, and that we've concluded in the Positive Energy team that there are 3 critical work tracks for decision makers, which also, as it turns out, are the work tracks for our research over the next 3 years, some of which has already begun. So, again, being potentially in the worst, and maybe in fact in the worst of both worlds, we are, no news here, falling short on our climate commitments. Again, probably not news, but maybe new, that we are undercutting Canada's most important export sector. I don't think we've got as far as putting, on the domestic front, putting the energy fundamentals at risk, although we've seen some evidence of that with respect to affordability in the electricity sector in Ontario, and we know that there are risks elsewhere throughout the domestic energy economy. One thing we know for sure is that we are generating a high-risk investor environment, and that may be across the board with respect to the Canadian economy. It's certainly true in the energy system, and all indications are that that, in fact, is growing. The erosion of public confidence, again, that's not new, but there are a lot of things going on that are, if anything, contributing to that. And of course, as Monica noted in her introduction, an increasingly polarized debate on energy and climate. What I like to think of is that on either side of the center of the debate, we seem to have the shouting classes who are occupying most of the airtime, and part of our objective, and I like to think the objective of a lot of other people in this room, is for some of that airtime to get taken over by some different folks. Multiple sources of uncertainty. One could spend a lot of time on this slide, and one won't, because in fact Monica is going to build on these themes in her part of the presentation. But maybe some sort of cross-cutting notions to think about is as we look at these, this is our judgment as to what are the principal sources of uncertainty. How many of these are long-standing? How many of them are new? Most of them, in fact, are probably long-standing. How many of them are specific to energy versus more widespread in their implications? And arguably, very little of this is unique to energy. Some of it bears more heavily on energy, but all of it is across the economy. And finally, which of these are growing? Where do we see rapid change in this sort of context? So again, Monica is going to come back to this. And again, critical work tracks for decision makers. This really is the core of what positive energy is going to be about for the next 3 years, is building a body of research and engagement that we think can contribute constructively to what the decision makers are going to actually have to do. So let me talk about some of the substance that underlies this. What we ended up doing in the course of trying to pull this work together is identified what we see here as 6 critical themes that will bear on the debate and the discussion over the course of the next few years. And I'm going to walk through each of these, and maybe start by emphasizing that we don't necessarily claim to any unique degree of wisdom with respect to this. There is a lot of expertise on energy and climate that's out there and in this audience. What we're suggesting, though, is that these are the principal themes that we should be thinking about. And again, hopeful that the critique we get from our panel and from others will bring more wisdom to the table. So let's start with lots of climate talk, but limited effective action. And for those of you who've been working this file for a while, this will be familiar territory. It is drearily familiar, is how I would characterize it. If you look going back to Rio, and then Kyoto, and then Copenhagen, and then Paris, going to international meetings where everybody with good intentions, no doubt, are committed to restraining the growth of greenhouse gas emissions, driving them down, and then we all came home and reality took over again, time after time after time. Now, whether that will prove to be true about Paris remains to be seen. We'll have to see how the numbers unfold. But I would be very, very surprised if we saw a very significant break from this pattern, unless we start to take the issue a bit more seriously. So why? Well, One good source of information to help us understand this is the International Energy Agency, and whose World Energy Outlook 2018 is instructive. And we've drawn two scenarios or snapshots of two scenarios from the World Energy Outlook. The first one, what they call the new policy scenario, essentially policies that have been put in place or at the very least announced by governments around the world. And where does it lead you? Some interesting things to look at. A growth in renewables for sure, rapid growth in renewables for sure, but from a very small base. So still occupying a relatively small part of the primary energy demand. Continuing presence of oil and refined petroleum products, whether we like it or not, going out to 2040, and in fact a very substantial presence. Again, based on policies in place or announced. Growth in natural gas demand for a number of reasons. And then perhaps surprising, still a great deal of coal in the primary energy mix. So let's get a little bit more aggressive, and this is what's called the Sustainable Development Scenario, which is intended to align with the Paris targets looking out to 2050. So coal declines. That's the bottom one again. Unlike the previous scenario, new renewables or renewables more generally take a much larger role. There is a downtick in the presence of oil and refined petroleum products in this world, largely reflective of the electrification of the transportation sector. Natural gas continues to play a very significant role in the picture. So bringing this back home to what we call Canadian energy realities, and again, this is the kind of thing we could spend the whole day just talking about this one slide and probably disagreeing and on all sorts of it, but some things to reflect on. Oil and gas is still the single largest export earner for Canada. The automobiles sector is close behind, and it varies depending on the state of prices, but still a hugely important part of the whole Canadian economy. International markets are going to determine a lot of the outcomes, and we see that looking back on the IEA slides. International markets are going to determine what happens to the supply and the demand with respect to oil and gas in particular. Other governments are going to have the biggest part of the game in terms of shaping policy, in terms of shaping where it goes. The United States, China, India, a lot of other large population countries are going to be the ones that shape the international reality as we look forward. And on the technology front, Canada will be a constructive contributor to the evolution of the technology that supports all of this. But by and large, we are going to be a technology taker. And at the end, consistent with the international picture, most of our energy consumption, and now I'm looking out to 2040, 2050, that vicinity, most of our energy consumption will still be based on oil and gas. And to the extent that we want to move away from that or move into a cleaner energy picture, we're looking at a very, very big infrastructure build in order to achieve that. All indications are that renewables will continue to decline in cost, but also that they will still be a relatively small part of supply, since most of the renewables are focused on the electricity sector, and electricity is still a relatively small part of energy end use. Public support at the high level polling, what you get is strong indications that the public want governments to act on greenhouse gas reductions. But put to it, when you get to individual consumers or individual communities, and it starts to involve things like energy costs or other impacts on the communities, that support looks very theoretical indeed. And we've seen that time and time again, and that is certainly we've seen that in the positive energy research. Part of the reason for that being that clean is all very nice, but all sources of energy have environmental and social costs. So I would love to spend the next part of the whole morning on this slide, but I promise I won't. This is from a credible analysis, the Trottier Energy Futures project, looking at what it might mean for Canada, at least in one scenario, in which we achieve the Paris target, looking out to 2050. Think of three things here. Electricity infrastructure, more than doubling. Maybe taking a very different form than we've seen traditionally, as we see distributed energy options and solar and storage, but still in all, more than doubling in 30 years what has taken us about 100 years to build, and doing it in a context where the public no longer just rolls over and takes it. Oil and gas production. 50% down, exports 50% down from 2013 levels. And just to ask yourself whether you can think of any other Canadian export industries that may have been coming under pressure lately and where that generated political controversy. Think about that across the Canadian economy. And the electrification of the transportation fleet. All sorts of things that may get in the way of that. But one of the things that we haven't been talking about is what does the Canadian transportation sector, our automobile industry, look like in this world? Do we have a big part of this world, or do we slowly fade away? We need to be thinking about that kind of thing. So we talk about the perils of vocabulary. And I just want to, there are all sorts of parts of the vocabulary in this discourse that we think have gotten in the way of things, but just think about this. The term NIMBY, that's an oldie, goes back several decades, and it has always been used pejoratively, and one of its effects has been to cut off debate, where sometimes there were some very legitimate reasons for that debate. On the other hand, turning it on its head, we've taken things like social license and consent and bandied those about in ways that have created expectations that governments can't meet. We talk about low carbon or low emissions, but we need to ask ourselves, to what extent does our vocabulary lead us to notions of fuel and technology determinism in a world where we know that the technology is changing very, very rapidly indeed, and what it's actually going to look like 20 or 30 years from now, we just don't know. I mentioned clean energy. It's a very subjective notion. For some people, it means low carbon. If it's somebody in a local community, it could mean low air emissions. It could mean a minimal other environmental impacts. But it gets bandied about as if we're actually agreeing on something. And finally, speaking as if we're actually agreeing on something, the notion of transition, really, if you stop to think about it, empty rhetoric. Transition appears to imply something inevitable. It's not. It's going to require a great deal of will. And it's, if you look at it closely, transformation may be a more accurate word. So bringing it to a close, again, we're all familiar with this, but Canada's distinctive character makes the whole thing tougher for Canada than it is for a lot of other countries. We can talk for a long time about the energy intensity of the Canadian economy and why it's as energy intensive as it is, but it is. And part of the reason for that is because we have a big resource economy. We are resource rich, not only in energy resources, but in others. That's a good thing. but it has implications for where we go in terms of the evolution of energy and the dealing with climate change. And part of the consequence of that is distinct regional endowments, and we're seeing today some of the implications of that as we see reactions in places like Alberta and Saskatchewan to what's been happening to the industry. A decentralized federation where we've seen this week not only do the provinces have the majority of the jurisdiction with respect to energy, but the government of British Columbia seems to think that one of Canada's most long-standing federal powers with respect to works and undertakings beyond the boundaries of a province should actually be trumped, as it were, by a provincial power, essentially property and civil rights within the province. So who knows where the courts are going to go, but it could become even more decentralized and tougher still for a national policy to come about. And finally, or not quite finally, strong democratic traditions, good, but with growing expectations on the part of the populace as to what that might mean in terms of decision making. And finally, a highly open economy, again, something that's been good for Canada for many, many years, but that in many ways makes these challenges even tougher. So with that in mind, I'm going to ask Monica to pick it up and take it from here.
Great. Thanks, Mike.